So welcome to our Bible study tonight. I'm glad that you're here, and I want to say that this is the third in the second trio of our Bible studies. So remember, we are not meeting next week, and then we're picking up 2 weeks from tonight on March the 8th with the last 3 sessions, with the last trio. You can see, if I can find my little clicker thingy, just as a reminder, this is our course overview. It tells you where we have been, and so tonight we're going to talk about 2 of the transformational keys that come out of this book, A Field Guide for the Missional Congregation. And those 2 keys are to cultivate a healthy climate and to build a supportive team of staff and leadership. Those will be the 2 topics for tonight. And we're going to do it slightly different than what you've been used to now. I like to throw people off. So we're not going to break into groups. We're going to stay in the big group, and we're going to do a lot more reading in the book of Acts than we've been used to, because there's a wonderful story I want you to read, and then we'll talk about it. But before we get there, let's just quickly recap what we talked about last week, both in case you weren't here or in case you've forgotten what we talked about. Yes, we talked about that second transformational key, that it's all about discipleship, right? And we made the point that membership has its privileges and discipleship has its cost. And we kind of contrasted those 2 with each other. Membership in a church meaning that you're on the roll, you pay your dues, you get the kind of pastoral services and church services that you want, and you can be a member in our evangelical Lutheran church by showing up once a year and giving $5. That makes you a member, as long as you do that. Discipleship, on the other hand, is really living into the teachings of Jesus Christ, and it is really following Jesus and what he would have us do, and that comes with a cost. Jesus himself is the best example for that, right? He gets himself killed. And he even says to us, take up your cross. Those who want to save their lives will lose it, and so on. And we talked a lot about that. And we talked about how the church, during the age of Christendom, after the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century became a Christian, how the church as the state religion really was operating in this membership kind of model, focused on its own institutional survival and on serving its members, rather than being about the sake of the church. And then we looked at the age gap, and we found out that of the builder generation, those who were born before 1946, 65% in surveys say that they are affiliated with a church or a religious group. And then as you look at the generations that come after that, right, it goes down each time, and it ends up with the millennials, those born after 1983, where only 4% are affiliated religiously. And that's just in your and my generation. I mean, look at this incredible change that has happened just in our lifetime. And then based on that, we talked about the discipleship church. What does it look like when a church is not focused just on serving the member and on surviving as an institution, but when the focus is really on empowering people for ministry and on serving the world, both locally and globally. And then we went to the book of Acts and looked at what happened in Antioch after Stephen was killed, and we had the great dispersion, and the Christians really spread out all over the Mediterranean. In Acts, there's wonderful descriptions about how they began to be a church in Antioch, and we split up into groups and looked at that. And then we finished up by talking about the 6 marks of discipleship that come out of Mike Foss's book called Power Search. You guys remember what those 6 marks are? We're talking about them on Wednesday night too, and you hear a little bit about them on Sundays. It's kind of our theme for Lent. So number 1, pray daily. Worship weekly, read the Bible every day, serve in the congregation and beyond, relate, that's the last one, relate with others for spiritual growth, and then tithe give or tithe, or move towards the tithe. So those are the 6 marks of discipleship. Okay, today we're still in that book talking about the transformational keys. And so today we're looking to start with at the 3rd transformational key. Developing healthy, spirit-led leadership can help cultivate a positive climate change within the faith community. A positive climate change. So it's a little bit about climate. What do we mean by climate? What do you think? How things are done in a church, right? How happy people are on some level, how people treat one another, how they deal with conflict, how they deal with disagreements, how they celebrate together. All that has to do with climate. You know this because you've been in those places. There are churches when you walk in the door, you can feel the tension. And you can feel that the climate just doesn't seem to be right. Maybe our own congregation is an example. People tell me that the climate 3 years ago in this place wasn't so wonderful. And that people as they walked in could tell that there was some conflict going on, and they're telling me how the climate has now changed, and now people are excited and people are positive and people look forward to coming to church. I had somebody tell me the other day, this was wonderful. Someone said to me, you know, Pastor, it used to be that I would come to church every once in a while, you know, maybe once a month or once every 5 weeks. Now I feel like I have to come every Sunday because if I don't come, I might miss something. That has to do with climate and how people feel about their church. So in Acts, and now we are really going to get in the book, I picked this. There's many passages I could have picked to talk about climate in the early church, but let's read together. This is from the 2nd chapter, and Pentecost has just happened, right? The Holy Spirit has come over all the people, and folks are kind of like they're drunk, and they're talking in different languages, and they're falling all over themselves. And Peter gets up and makes a speech, and that's where we're picking up. Would somebody like to read this slide for us? Just to have a few other voices here. Go ahead.
Peter said, change your life, turn to God and be baptized, each of you in the name of Jesus Christ, so your sins are forgiven. Receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. The promise is targeted to you and your children, but also to all who are far away, whomever, in fact, our Master God invites. He went on in this vein for a long time, urging them over and over, get out while you can, get out of this sick and stupid culture.
All right. Virginia, you want to pick up?
That day, about 3,000 took him at his word, were baptized, and were signed up. They committed themselves to the teaching of the apostles, the life together, the common meal, and the prayers. Everyone around was in awe. All those wonders and signs done through the apostles, and all the believers lived in a wonderful harmony, holding everything in common. They sold whatever they owned and pooled their resources so that each person's need was met. They followed a daily discipline of worship in the temple, followed by meals at home. Every meal a celebration, exuberant and joyful as they praised God. People in general liked what they saw. Every day their number grew as God added those who were saved.
All right. So you may well leave it on because I'm going to look for some folks to do some talking. How do you think this text talks to the climate in the church? What do you see in here that tells you what the climate was in that early Christian community?
Every meal was a celebration, exuberant and joyful.
Yep, there was a lot of joy, right? People liked being with each other. What else?
They took care of everybody's needs. They took care of the needs.
They took care of the needs. In fact, it almost sounds a little communist, doesn't it? They gave up like private ownership and they pooled their resources and they made sure that everybody needed what they needed. Anything else? Yes, Linda.
They had daily discipline of worship.
Daily discipline of worship. In fact, remember, this is the time when Christianity is still a kind of a sect within Judaism, so they still go to the temple, they are still as observant Jews, but then they meet in each other's house where they have these joyful meals and they follow this daily discipline. So a good climate and being joyful and exuberant and hopeful doesn't mean that everything goes and you kind of slack off and you do whatever you like. There is a discipline that they followed, even daily. Let's look back here. What else is there that you think shows the climate?
Wonderful harmony.
That's just what I wanted you to pick up, right?
Wonderful harmony.
There was a wonderful harmony there.
Holding everything in common.
That's right. They're holding everything in common.
This sounds a little like PR. This just sounds too good.
Well, particularly if you read in the rest of the book of Acts how they were fighting and disagreeing and how the persecution started and how people got killed and all that kind of stuff, right? So it wasn't just all hunky-dory either. But certainly there was a sense of community and a sense of sharing in what Jesus had been teaching and the church that Jesus had started, right? Anything else you see? Let's look in the beginning here. How do you like the sick and stupid culture? This is the Message translation.
What is the normal translation of that?
What is the normal translation of that? Somebody look it up. Did you bring an NRSV? I can look it up on my phone, but that would take a little while. This would be chapter 2, verse 40. Say that again.
Be saved from this perverse generation.
Be saved
From this perverse generation.
from this perverse generation. Corrupt generation in your, yeah. Well, stupid and perverse and corrupt, that isn't so far from each other, is it? I mean, the Message always says it as it is. It doesn't mince any words.
I like the other words better.
You do? Corrupt?
I know.
Perverse.
That is like
Yeah.
a child talking.
Okay. All right, any last thoughts about climate and how that is described here? Sure.
They committed themselves to the teaching of the apostles.
Right, they committed.
Their life together, the common meal and the prayer.
Right. They committed themselves to the teaching of the apostles, the life together, the common meal, and the prayers. Again, there is that discipline, right? And they were really serious about following Jesus and implementing what Jesus had been teaching them. I mean, that's what this is all about, right? So let's talk a little bit about how that looks in our church. How do you think? Oh, are you ready to move on, or do you still have a comment?
I actually have a question. It's on the next page.
On the next page. There we go.
It says, people in general like what they saw. Who are the people? The people in the community or the community around them?
Good question.
Well, what do you guys think?
Well, it says every day new people were added. So
It says every day new people were added, so the people in general are the people who don't belong to the church, who are not Christian, right? Who are kind of watching those Christians and wondering what's going on and what they're doing, and they seem to have liked
outsiders.
what they saw, the outsiders. That's a good bridge to my next question. How do you see this happening in our church? What do you think the climate is in our church at Christ the King? Anybody?
Sunday, I was in traditional and pastor was speaking, and of course I don't remember half of it, but the part I did remember said to me that this is a community, and this is what people miss if they don't come to church, because they could be home worshiping it all by themselves or reading the Bible, but it's the others that come in and care for each other,
So it's
which I think we do a good job of.
It's about relationship and about being in community with one another. Other thoughts about what the climate is like here?
It's sort of like a village, like old-time village.
Okay.
We don't
necessarily have the types of jobs of a village, some of us do, but as time goes on, we do develop relationships with each other, and this is where I come for community.
Mm-hmm.
I don't do it anywhere else. I do it here.
Here. Good. Well, in the book, in the missional field guide, there is one little section that I particularly like, so I thought I'd read that to you. It says there, leaders that learn to engage in adaptive change understand that such change isn't about implementing the right program, following a specific formula, having the right answers, or developing the correct organizational structure. These are all helpful in addressing technical needs, but adaptive leadership means learning a range of practices that can be engaged with flexibility and creativity in changing context and in different situations. Leadership in this sense is an art where leaders summon forth originality and creativity as one seeks to serve as God's transforming agent for the sake of the church and the world. This is from Mike Voss in his missional field guide. Oh no, I'm sorry, this is wrong. This is from Rick Rouse and Greg van Gelder. Mike Voss is the other guy with the six marks of discipleship. I like that quote because to me it shows how a church can engage in a climate change that really makes a difference and how it has to be adaptive, right? In organizational theory, an adaptive leadership means that you're always responding to the needs and you're very cognizant of the context, right? And you really use some creativity and originality as you make decisions and design whatever programming you're going to do. This is important to me. When I was serving as a bishop in the Delaware, Maryland Synod and worked with almost 200 congregations, so often the congregations, when I visited or sat with their church council or did strategic planning with one of their committees, people always thought it was about doing the right kind of program. Oh, if only we had a food pantry, then people would come and they would get to know us and then they'd come to church and, well, if a food pantry saved the church, our congregations would be in much better health because many congregations have food pantries and do a great job at it. But that doesn't necessarily build up the church. That serves the neighborhood, and it's a worthwhile thing to do, right? Or people would say, if only we had a bang-up music program and a great organist and a terrific choir and all that. Well, that will make a difference, and that's important to think about. But that by itself is not going to give you a healthy climate, right? There's so much else that goes into that. And it doesn't always have to do with programming and activities, but it has to do with relationship. Thank you for that, Nancy. That is really the key, the relationship that leads you to the community so that people get that out of there. So Kelly Fryer, this time I'm right, that really is who said this, has 5 strategic behaviors that she talks about that churches can employ as they want to do a climate change. And they're really quite simple, but I think it's important to think about them. One is to get focused. That is to really know what you're about and what your vision is and what your goals are for the year, and then to go for it, as opposed to doing everything and nothing all over the place, right? Kind of makes sense to be focused on your purpose, on what you're about. It's about setting people free so that they can live out their faith in their daily lives, right? That's very different from being about institutional survival or making sure the building is nice or that there's enough money in the till. Those are important things too, right? But the focus is on setting people free so they can do ministry in their lives. Taking action, even long-term actions where you're planning something and you really focus on that. The example she gives in her book was that in Seville, Spain, They took bold and courageous actions in 1401 because they had this vision that they wanted to build a church. And it took them several hundred years, but the church in Seville in Spain is one of the wonderful cathedrals that you can visit to this day. Fourth, that you should expect surprises. Things never go the way you plan them. There'll always be some adjustments that need to be made. That's where that adaptive leadership idea comes in. And then number 5, to be hopeful. Now that sounds kind of course, if we don't have hope as people of God, who in the world is going to have hope? But we know so many churches that are, declining, and in the ELCA, 85% of congregations are declining, and if you go to them, you don't find a whole lot of hope. People are worried, they fear that they're going to have to close the door, things aren't going well, there's fewer people in the pews and all that, and they are not always hopeful because they're not focusing on where that hope comes from, right? And how God works even through failure and through small congregations. So any thoughts on anybody's part about this climate key and how did it look like? Yeah, Virginia.
I see these as great abstract behaviors, but for me, when you get down to the practical application, that's where, in my opinion, or my experience has been, that's where it gets a little chaotic, because for a congregation this size, what's the focus going to be? Is it going to be something like we're all going to get behind, the food pantry idea, for instance? Well, somebody else wants to do this and somebody else wants to do that. And so consequently, there's all these little things going on. Or to set people free, what does that look like? How do we do that? When people disagree on, who should be accepted, or whether we should be baptized before we have communion, or so that's, I guess, where I'm getting to. I think taking action, expecting surprises, and being hopeful, I can see that, but getting focused on what? So,
and I think you're right in saying that a larger church probably needs to do more work around that. It's easier for a smaller group to maybe agree and all be on the same page and then move forward, right? Although, to have a good fight, it only takes 3 people, actually. So, but
I thought it was 2.
right. But in our case, yeah, you thought it was 2. In our case, we've just now finished our strategic planning process that took the better part of 2 years, where we very intentionally said, what is it God is calling us to do? What is our purpose? What are our guiding principles? What are our strategies? And that just got adopted by the Church Council last Sunday. So you'll hear the next newsletter has all of that in there. So look at that. That's a way to focus, because now we know which direction we're going to march in. I had a question over here. Right, Herman?
Yeah, actually, not a question, a comment. I can give an example that we do for setting people free. And what it is, my example is the Spring Day of Service.
Amen. Which is coming up, right?
Yeah, right. It's coming up in April. The outreach ministry, use the new term, outreach ministry has people who take on organizing and see everything going right in that. There are many, I forget how many there are, different activities involved with that. The people that run each activity are free to do it in the way they see fit to do it. So that there are people, there's a lot of freedom there. Nobody is sitting up there in the outreach ministry telling them how to do any one of those things. They each figure it out for themselves.
Amen. Great. Thank you, Herman, for that example. I'm ready to move on to the next key, but we'll take one more comment.
When you talked about getting focused and taking action, I think that outreach is another place. Before last January, I think a lot of people didn't know what was going on around the church, but then we definitely, the outreach committee decided to put something out there for like all the activities we usually do every month, like collecting food or collecting clothes for people, or, all those different things, so that people could see what goes on here.
The 500 things?
Yeah, the 500 things.
Yes, for the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, every month we had something to do with 500. We collected 500 pairs of socks one month, and then did 500 cans of food, right? That kind of thing. Yeah. Well, you're right, when you want to get focused, the big piece of that is communications, right? And letting people know what's going on. All right, you ready to move on to the next one? The next key, it is imperative that care and intentionality be taken to build a supportive missional leadership team that is comprised of both staff and lay leaders. See, that's especially important in a larger congregation where there is a staff. This church has a staff of 16 people. Did you know that? And so it's very important that the church council and the elected leaders and the leaders in the various teams and committees and task forces and ministries, that they are on one page, that they march in the same direction. So much of the conflict that happens in churches happens because there isn't good communication or good relationship amongst the leadership, and there's disagreements, and they're not always handled in a good way, right? So as we think about staff and leadership development, here's a bunch of things I want to lift up. And this was something when the core committee interviewed me almost 2 years ago, no, not a year and a half ago now, right? That was one thing that they said. They said our staff is really demoralized, and we need to pay some attention to how we deal with them, right? And so I think the first thing that was important was the understanding that when you're on a church staff, it's not just an employment relationship. It really is a covenant relationship. I don't know if you realize this, but as a pastor or as someone who works on a church staff, you actually get to live out your faith every day. And you get paid for it on top of it. It's wonderful. I can't think of a better job, right? But it is a covenant relationship because it does involve your own faith. And it does involve how you want to live out your faith and your love of Jesus in the world. It's not just a 9-to-5 job where you have a contract, and because the clock says 4:45, you pack up your stuff and you go home, right? It's a very different, we call that a covenant relationship. Even though it's important to have defined job descriptions and to be clear what the expectations are, churches are terrible at that. They hire people all over the place, they call pastors, and they never talk about what these folks are supposed to be doing and who expects what of whom. There needs to be intentional staff meetings, which here wasn't happening actually since I came. We meet every Tuesday morning, the staff gets together. And once a month we have what we call all staff, where we pull in even staff that isn't necessarily in the building all the time or that's part-time, because we want to make sure that we function as a team. And when we come together as an all staff, we worship together and we share communion. Because again, we are not just workers in some organization. We are people on a staff of the church. That's very different. I instituted something I call staff play days. We've done that twice now, where we take some time out of the day and we go and play together as a staff. We went bowling 3 months ago or whenever that was, right? And people are going to say, what? We pay you and, you go off and you go bowling during working hours? Well, yes. Thank you. And, yes, because that helps to build the camaraderie and the relationships amongst the staff. Team building. It's amazing what difference that makes, right? Same with the retreats. I insisted when I came, right away we had a staff retreat overnight, and then we had a second one, again overnight down at Agape when Pastor Daniel joined us. And again, we used the staff retreat both to build relationships and do some team building, but then also to do some visioning and some planning and some talking about how each of us saw our job in relationship to the overall work that was before us. This is true for the council too. Your church council goes on overnight retreat once a year. We've now established kind of the last weekend in January, so we just had one of those. And again, it's amazing to me what a difference that makes. I've insisted that it be an overnight. Over the years, people had kind of gotten away from that because they cost too much money and people don't have that much time, and it's so much easier to meet here at the church and then go home and come back the next morning. Well, what you miss out on, can I be really honest with you? What you miss out on is, that those 2 hours or 3 hours after the meeting and after the evening worship, when you sit around the fire and you share a little scotch or a beer or a wine or a Diet Pepsi or whatever, and you just kind of talk and you socialize. Again, it's a relationship building kind of a thing. The latest thing we are doing, this will be interesting, we just started that. We have now started to do small groups at church council meetings. You may have heard, I hope you have, about the small group ministry that has begun here. Right now we are training 6 people to be small group leaders, and then the idea is that they would begin to have small lay-led home-based groups. We have small groups in the church, had for a long time. What we want to add to that is a more intentional way of having small groups. Maybe, hopefully, eventually 40 or 50 of those where 4 or 5 people meet together weekly, every other week, to do Bible study, to support one another, provide pastoral care to each other, share their highs and lows, do a service project together, pray together. And really, again, it's all about relationship and build those relationships. This, by the way, came out of, when I first came, you might remember this, I did these cottage meetings, right? Many of you were there. And over the span of about 6 months, I did 27 cottage meetings, and more than 330 people were involved in this, which I thought was wonderful. I don't know that there was a single meeting where I didn't hear people moan about the fact that we are 4 congregations and we don't know who is in the other service, and which to me said we have some work to do in building relationship, in getting to know one another, in truly being brothers and sisters in the faith. That's what these small groups are about, to provide a arena, a place where people can really support one another and really become brothers and sisters in the faith, right? And study the Bible together and support one another. And we have at the retreat at the end of January, this is a long answer, at the end of January, we began to split up our council into small groups. And now at every council meeting, we are spending 15 minutes, Herman will tell you, he's on the council, we're spending 15 minutes in our small groups, there's 4 to each group, reading a Bible verse or a Bible passage and talking about our lives and the highs and the lows, and then praying for each other. Real simple, but it makes a huge difference in how we see one another. And it works well, Herman says, right? You enjoyed that the other night. So we'll be doing that all year, and we'll be watching it. So here is my last slide before we really get into the book of Acts, and that has to do with the marks of healthy spirit-led relationship. Again, this comes from Rouse and Van Gelder. Spirit-led leaders who are healthy are spiritually grounded. That means they are about prayer, they attend worship, they give. That doesn't mean they are perfect. That doesn't mean they are not making mistakes. That doesn't mean they couldn't do better in any of these, but it means that they take seriously being disciples themselves. You can't really make disciples if you yourself are not a disciple, right? And so leaders in the church need to be spiritually grounded. Think about that. I mean, when we elect people to the church council, do we even ask, do these people come to worship regularly? Are they tithers, or do they give seriously to the church's needs and to the mission needs of the church? Do they pray? Do they have a healthy relationship with Jesus? Again, not that they have to be perfect. My relationship with Jesus isn't perfect. God knows that, and Margaret does too. But they need to make some effort, right? They need to be about what the church is about. They need to be able to manage their own anxiety, Rausenfengelder says. That's interesting to me. It comes out of the, maybe more psychological world, where healthy leaders are self-aware and they know themselves and they know what ticks them off and they know what makes them tick. And so they are able to provide that adaptive kind of leadership that we talked about, right? They take positions and stay connected. So there's a self-differentiation going on. It's not just about what they like and how they want to do something and they want their way all the time, but they are able to listen. They focus on presence and functioning. That is, they respond calmly and keep perspective. That's important when there are disagreements, right? So when someone comes up and says, I really don't like that our council is doing X, they don't get all defensive and rattled, but they listen and they say, thank you for sharing your concern, right? I will take that back to the council, or I will do X, Y, Z, but they have self-differentiation and they keep calm and they keep perspective. They focus always on vision and mission. So once you have your strategic plan and your strategic directions, as we now do, that's what drives you. And so that's what you focus on, and when something else comes along, you stay the course and you say, if we do this program, will that really help us get into this strategic direction? And if it doesn't, you have to learn the art of saying no, which is another big thing that churches sometimes don't do. They focus on the strength rather than the weaknesses, right? The glass is half full, not half empty, so they have a positive spirit about them. And they challenge themselves and others in the art of collaboration and empowerment. Those are the 7 things that they call the marks of healthy spirit-led leadership. So I thought, and we still have enough time, I thought what we would do, I want us to get into the book of Acts, chapter 27. I have to tell you, this reads like a novel. I mean, John Grisham hasn't written anything that's more exciting than this. It has everything in there. And I thought we would read it, and then we'll talk about how you see leadership qualities in there, particularly in Paul, whom you will see provides a lot of leadership based on what I just was talking and teaching about. All right? So, but let's start. It's going to take a little bit to read because we're going to read the entire chapter. And again, if we can have different voices. So who would like to start? Somebody over here? Linda? Okay.
I'm talking all day.
That's quite all right. You have a very nice voice.
A storm at sea, Acts 27. As soon as arrangements were complete for our sailing to Italy, Paul and a few other prisoners were placed under the supervision of a centurion named Julius, a member of an elite guard. We boarded a ship from Adramyttium that was bound for Ephesus and ports west. Aristarchus and a Macedonian from Thessalonica went with us. The next day we put in at Sidon. Julius treated Paul most decently, let him get off the ship and enjoy the hospitality of his friends there. Out to sea again, we sailed north under the protection of the northeast shore of Cyprus, because winds out of the west were against us, and then along the coast westward to the port of Myra.
Okay, would you pass it on to someone?
There the centurion found an Egyptian ship headed for Italy and transported us on board. We ran into bad weather and found it impossible to stay on course. After much difficulty, we finally made it to the southern coast of the island of Crete and docked at Good Harbor, appropriate name. By this time, we had lost a lot of time. We had passed the autumn equinox, so it would be stormy weather from now on through the winter, too dangerous for sailing. Paul warned, I see only disaster ahead for cargo and ship, to say nothing of our lives if we put out to sea now. But it was not the best harbor for staying the winter. Phoenix, a few miles further on, was more suitable. The centurion set Paul's warning aside and let the ship captain and the ship owner talking into trying for the next harbor.
All right, next person. Sherry?
When a gentle southerly breeze came up, they weighed anchor, thinking it would be smooth sailing. But they were no sooner out to sea than a gale-force wind, the infamous nor'easter, struck. They lost all control of the ship. It was a cork in the storm. They came under the lee of the small island named Clauda and managed to get a lifeboat ready and reef the sails. But rocky shoals prevented us from getting close. We only managed to avoid them by throwing out drift anchors. Next day, out on the high seas again, and badly damaged now by the storm, we dumped the cargo overboard. The third day, the sailors lightened the ship further by throwing off all the tackle and provisions. It had been many days since we had seen either sun or stars. Wind and waves were battering us unmercifully, and we lost all hope of rescue.
Okay, who wants to pick up from there?
With our appetite for both food and life long gone, Paul took his place in our midst and said, "Friends, you really should have listened to me back in Crete. We could have avoided all this trouble and trial, but there's no need to dwell on that now. From now on, things are looking up. I can assure you that there will not be a single drowning among us, although I can't say as much for the ship. The ship itself is doomed. Last night, God's angel stood at my side, an angel of this God I serve, saying to me, 'Don't give up, Paul. You're going to stand before Caesar yet, and everyone sailing with you is also going to make it. So, dear friends, take heart. I believe God will do exactly what he told me, but we're going to shipwreck on some island or other.'"
Okay, next.
On the 14th night, adrift somewhere on the Adriatic Sea at about midnight, the sailors sensed that we were approaching land. Sounding, they measured a depth of 120 feet, and shortly after that, 90 feet. Afraid that we were about to run aground, they threw out 4 anchors and prayed for daylight. Some of the sailors tried to jump ship. They let down the lifeboat, pretending they were going to set out more anchors from the bow. Paul saw through their guise and told the centurion and his soldiers, "If those sailors don't stay with the ship, we're all going down." So the soldiers cut the lines to the lifeboat and let it drift off. With dawn about to break, Paul called everyone together and proposed breakfast. "This is the 14th day we've gone without food. None of us has felt like eating."
Okay.
But I urge to eat something. Now you will need strength for the rescue ahead. You are going to come out of this without even a scratch." He broke the bread and gave thanks to God. Pass it around. They all
ate
hardly
276
of us, all told, with the meal finished and everyone filled the ship.
The ship was further lightened.
Ship was further lightened by dumping the grain overboard. But at daybreak, no one recognized the land, but then they did notice a bay with a nice beach. decided to try to run to the ship up on the beach. They cut the anchors, loosed the tiller, raised the sails, and ran before the wind toward the beach. But we did not make it still fair from the shore. We hit a reef and the ship began to break up.
Wow, what a great job, Joseph. Thank you. Pass it on. One more little piece here.
The soldiers decided to kill the prisoners so none could escape by swimming. But the centurion, determined to save Paul, stopped them. He gave orders for anyone who could swim to dive in and go for it, and for the rest to grab a plank. Everyone made it to shore safely.
What a story, huh? Wow. I mean, this could be a Christian novel, don't you think? So, think about Paul in this situation. What's Paul doing? Why is he on this ship? He's a prisoner. Where is he going? He's going to Rome to talk to Caesar, right? Because he wants to appeal to Caesar to get his prison sentence overturned. And so he's on this ship. He's a prisoner. He has no status whatsoever. He's not the leader. He's not the captain. He's not one of the soldiers. He's a prisoner. And usually people don't listen to prisoners. But what is Paul doing? How do you see him provide leadership in this situation?
Tells him what's going to happen.
He tells him what's going to happen, right?
He remained calm.
And he calms them down when crisis hits. What else?
He becomes friends with the captors.
He becomes friends, especially the centurion. We don't know what's going on there really, but the centurion clearly respects Paul. Whatever Paul did, this centurion is convinced. In fact, in the very end, when the soldiers are ready to kill all the prisoners so they won't run away after the shipwreck, it's the centurion who stops them because he wants to save Paul, right? What else?
He reassures them that they're all going to live.
He reassures them that they're all going to live. And how does he know that?
Because an angel told him.
An angel told him, right? An angel told him that no lives would be lost, but the ship was going to be lost. The ship there that was doomed, right? Now, I find that interesting because when we start this chapter, he actually makes a prediction that doesn't come true. He says, if we go now, everybody's going to die and we're going to lose all of our lives and the ship is going to go down and all that. And that really doesn't happen. So even though he has made a prediction that didn't come through, he had enough leadership ability to not let that get him set back, but to still be a leader and to still predict things and to still, calm them down and reassure them and tell them what was going to happen next.
Smart, scholarly pastor kind of.
Smart, scholarly pastor kind of what?
kind of thing.
Kind of thing, okay. That's what you think it is, okay.
Well, I mean, he's very smart and well trained as a rabbi.
A rabbi, right? Yeah, okay. Good. What else do you find in this story? And by the way, I should have given that out. I do have copies of this text because when you're looking at a long text like that, it's sometimes, when you want to look at something, exactly. So I'm going to give that out now. Sorry, I didn't think of that before. Just take one and pass it along.
Pastor,
Yep.
I was thinking of the disciples in the boat with Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And the storm came and the disciples were all nervous and Jesus calmed the sea and calmed
Right.
them. It has a lot of parallels.
Yep, there are parallels to that, clearly,
I
right?
think it's a lot like the Odyssey.
It's a lot like the Odyssey. All right, say some more.
What?
Say some more about that.
How they go from one place to the next place to the next place.
Mhm.
Every place has something they have to overcome, and traps and different things that take years to get home. So, I don't know, it just seems very Odyssey-like.
Certainly in the epic story that unfolds here. And this is just one chapter, right? Now, as a bonus, when you get home, you ought to read chapter 28, which is the last chapter of Acts, and it actually tells you that the island where they are shipwrecked is the island of Malta. They didn't know that at this time, but they find that out. And he does get to Rome at the end of that chapter. Yes, sir.
I was just surprised at how many people are on that ship.
276. It's
So
quite a
that
ship.
must
Yep.
have been a good size
Was it
ship.
a rowing boat kind?
Yeah.
They have the rowers?
Yeah.
Well, I understood that it was more of a sailboat, right?
Well, those
Because
Roman-
they're talking about the wind and
Right, but those Roman ships, in the bottom it's called galley.
yes,
and
they would have.
people chained down there,
Right.
and then they have the sailboat,
Right.
too.
Mhm.
But it must have been huge, because 276 people
Right.
on a boat is a lot of people.
Yeah, clearly it wasn't just some little rowboat or something, right? Other comments? Yes, Virginia.
Well, I like that he said, friends, you really should have listened
To me.
Like, not a little dig in there. But we're not going to dwell on that. We're just going to move forward. So,
That's very good, because again, that shows some leadership, right?
Yes,
He could have been totally. He could have said, "Well, you didn't listen to me before, so you forget you." Right. But he got over that.
Yes.
So.
I thought that was, it sort of made me laugh. But I also felt like he was the calm on that boat. And, you know, who was confident about the impossible, really. That he knew they were just going to be okay. God sent me an angel, I'm not worried. So I think in a group of people, it's always good to have somebody that's got their feet on the ground and can
Amen.
keep the
Yes.
calm, you know, amongst everybody else who wants to rimmel around in chaos.
So that's very easily transferred to a congregation, right? And how leaders in a congregation have to show some of those leadership qualities that we find with Paul in this story. Other comments? Yep, Stan.
I'll just say, even when we were going through the turmoil, I've lost track, to be honest. When we brought in the interim pastor, for instance, Pastor Westfall and then Pastor Kildy coming in, those were good signs of leadership, of bringing a calm to the storm to help us get refocused. And also, again, to let us be free to be creative, to see where we wanted to go with this congregation. So I think we've had our own perfect example right here.
All right. Well, I couldn't have made those connections better myself. Thank you, Stan.
Shirley calls that the refiner's fire.
The refiner's fire, yeah.
Shirley said that's what we went through, a refiner's fire.
Okay. Well, if you don't have anything more to say, we are almost out of time anyway. It's almost 7 o'clock. I want to thank you again for coming. So remember, we are not meeting next week. And on March the 8th, in 2 weeks, we start our last trio. And finally, we get to talk about conflict. I've been waiting for this for 2 months now. Conflict is a great thing to talk about in the church, don't you think? Can we do? I love at Christ the King that we often conclude meetings by standing and saying the Lord's Prayer. Can we do that together? And if you're comfortable, let's join hands together and pray in the words that Jesus himself taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. All right, go in peace and serve the Lord.